Thank you very much for inviting me. Muchas gracias para invitarme. Siento un cariño especial por España porque el rey español le dio a mi padre una beca.
I'm very proud of being in Madrid. The King of Spain, back in 77, gave my father an award. He was able to study medicine. I'm very happy and very proud to be here today among my Spanish friends.
My Spanish is not quite good enough to do the rest of the lecture in Spanish, so I hope you'll excuse me as I switch to English. So I'm going to present some of the main ideas in my book, Principles of Economics, which has just been published yesterday by De Justo. The book explains economics from the Austrian school perspective, which I believe is a perspective that is much more useful for studying economics than the usual textbooks that we study in universities around the world today. When I was a university professor and after I left my university, I've always run into people who are very successful, very smart people, and they always, they're successful doctors or engineers, and they talk about how they took an economics class in university, but it didn't really make much sense for them. They don't understand it. They got the right grade. They could solve the problems. They did what they had to do to get the grade, but they never quite understood it, and it never really made a lot of sense for them. And I believe it's because it's not in the Austrian tradition. I think the Austrian tradition does a much better job because the regular economics that you study in university is mostly models that are not very relevant to your real life. It's like math exercises that are not very useful for thinking about economics. There's a place for math, of course, but that's the math class. In economics, you'd like to learn about economics. And when I wrote the Bitcoin standard, I found that a lot of people were interested in the economic part of the Bitcoin standard, even though it's a Bitcoin book. 70% roughly of the book, the first 7 chapters of the book, don't even discuss Bitcoin. They talk about economics in general. So I thought a lot of people like that because they like the Austrian approach to economics, and I think it's very useful. And it's something that I also noticed when I was teaching in university. A lot of students would appreciate this. But there isn't a good Austrian textbook in economics that you could teach at university. So I've always wanted to write this. And after I wrote the Bitcoin standard, I decided this was the time for me to do this. And I spent about 4.5 years working on publishing this book. So this is the book that I would have liked to teach at university. It's the book that I would have also loved to learn at university. It's the book that I would have loved to have when I was 18, when I was first beginning to become curious about economics. I would have loved to have had this book to understand these concepts, which are really important in day-to-day life, in business, in all kinds of manners of life. But we don't really discuss them so much in economics. So I tried to present this as a kind of clear and concise, readable treatment of the main economic ideas in the Austrian tradition to present an understanding of the civilizational importance of the market and monetary order. This is the attempt of what this book does. It's not just to explain the economic concepts, but to build up these economic concepts into explaining how this, how the economizing of people and how economic activity leads to the development of civilization. It's truly a very important thing. So initially we begin the book with discussing the fundamentals of economics and the fundamentals of economics from the Austrian approach and how it differs from the regular approach that most people are used to in their university textbook. The first thing is that from the Austrian approach we look at economics from the perspective of human action. Economics is a study of how human beings act under the context of scarcity. We live in a world of scarcity where things are scarce. We don't have enough of the things that we want. We want more things than we have, and so therefore we're always having to make choices. And that choice is what creates economics. So from the Mises approach, the Austrian school approach, we analyze economic questions through the lens of how human beings act, because we think of that as being the motivating force and the animating force of all economic relations. You look around at the world, if humans weren't acting, then everything around us is just dead matter. And it's matter that dies and it doesn't do anything. Only when humans act, only when we make decisions and we make choices do we start valuing things. Only then does economics emerge, only through the action of human beings. So therefore, if you want to study economics, you have to study it through the action of human beings, because human beings are the ones that give the world value, and they're the ones that make all of those economic relationships happen. Now, the regular economics that you learn at university largely copies physics. About 100 years ago, economics decided that they wanted to be like physics, and they've been trying to make equations to study mathematical and statistical aggregates and find relationships between them. And that's more or less what the most of the textbooks that are taught at university teach. But in 1 century of economics in the quantitative tradition, we've never been able to come up with one single rule or law of economics that can withstand scientific scrutiny. So in chemistry, in physics, they make up formulas and they test those formulas in the lab, and all it takes is one scientist, one lab, in one time, finding an example of an equation not being 100% accurate, and then the law and the relationships and the rules that are established are destroyed. This is how science works. Science works by testing ideas. And yet in economics, they want to have the halo of science, they want to have the image of science that we are doing something scientific, except in that world we cannot develop these scientific relationships in a way that withstands scrutiny. So one of the most famous examples of economic relationships that are presented in a manner that seems scientific, like physics or chemistry, is this idea that there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And that if you look at the relationship between them, there needs to be a downward sloping line, that you either have high unemployment and low inflation, or high inflation and low unemployment. And therefore, this graph should look like a straight downward sloping line, or at least a curved maybe, but at least a downward sloping line. And yet, if you plot unemployment and inflation, you don't find this relationship. You find that sometimes you have high unemployment and high inflation, sometimes you have low unemployment and low inflation, and it's all over. There is no relationship. So in a science, in a real quantitative science, all it takes is one example of one country having unemployment and high unemployment and high inflation, and then this idea that there's a trade-off between the two is dead. In macroeconomics, because it's all, fluffy pseudoscience, then we can have hundreds of examples. Doesn't matter. They still teach this in the university because it's the best that they have. This is the rule that they have, and they've gotten used to it, and they have a lot of test banks with exams about it, and they just keep teaching it. It's not scientific in any real sense, but it continues to survive because in that world, there isn't any kind of real scientific method that is being applied. Well, the Austrian approach is different. We don't claim that we can develop these quantitative relationships to explain how economics works, because we can't. But we can, I believe, learn so much more that is useful about economics and about how economics can be useful for you as an individual by simply thinking of economic decision-making through the lens of human action. So that is really the difference. So, for example, a good way to illustrate this is to think about something like the minimum wage laws. From the regular mainstream approach towards looking at a question like minimum wage laws, the approach would be to try and establish quantitative relationships that say that if we raise the minimum wage by this much, then we would expect that aggregate spending would go up by this much, unemployment would decline by this much. We have all these relationships that we study, and we assume that they're going to work that way. And so we make a model and we take a guess, and then of course the model doesn't materialize because the world doesn't work according to our models. But we keep making those guesses anyway, and we try our best, just like the previous model. Whereas from the Austrian approach, we think in terms of human action. We don't think of aggregates. We don't think of the unemployment rate and the inflation rate and the minimum wage as an aggregate number and how it affects those things. We think in terms of the human beings that are acting. So when we want to think about the minimum wage law, we analyze what would be the reaction of human beings that are subject to this law. So we think about the business that is hiring people, and we think from the perspective of the business, if they were hiring somebody and paying that person, let's say 10 euros a day, and now the law says you have to pay that person 20 euros, we think from the perspective of the human that is acting, that runs that business. What is that person going to do? Why was he paying 10 euros? Most likely he's paying 10 euros because that was the marginal productivity of the person. Adding that person to your job gives you, let's say, 12 euros extra of revenue. So you pay him 10 euros and you make 2 extra euros. But now if you have to pay him 20 euros, what is your choice as a human being? What is the act that a human being takes in that? Still, a choice is, I'm not going to hire somebody who adds 12 euros to the business who costs me 20 euros. So when you see it through the lens of human action, you don't care about these aggregate relationships. You care about what the human being is doing, and you see that this is going to lead to more people losing their jobs. And I think empirically, if you look around, you see that minimum wage laws are heavily associated with an increase in unemployment, because that's how human beings react. If people have to pay more for something than it is worth for them, they're just not going to buy it. So the real minimum wage ends up being 0. The people don't end up working in the first place. So this is kind of the approach of the Austrian school. The second topic, which is chapter 2, is value. And this is one of the most important ways in which the Austrian approach differs from the mainstream approach to economics, which is that in the Austrian approach, value is understood as being subjective. And so you cannot measure it, and you cannot attach quantitative values to it. So you think about it in terms of its being subjective, because valuation only happens when human beings value things. And so, because we live in a world of scarcity, scarcity forces us to choose between different options, and when we start choosing between different options, we start valuing them. And we attach a valuation to different objects, which is comparable to other objects. So you choose A over B, that means you value A more than B. Thinking in terms of value is very useful, and it's very important because from the Austrian perspective, we understand that value is not intrinsic in things. Nothing has intrinsic value. Value is in our mind. Value is a property of our minds that is projected onto physical goods. It's not something that physical goods have inside them. And so, as Karl Menger explains, it's not an independent thing that exists by itself. Things don't exist with a valuation. There's no price tag that says this thing you should value at this much. Human beings value things. So that's why in the 17th century, oil had the negative value. You had to pay people to take the oil out of your land if you wanted to use your land, because oil was a thing that ruined the land. Then we discovered that we could put that oil in an engine. Suddenly we gave it a positive value. Then in April 2020 or March 2020, when the world was shut down with the corona shutdowns, at that point, all of these oil producers had excess capacity of oil that they didn't know what to do with. They didn't have a place to store it, so they were actually paying people to take oil off their hands because there was nowhere else to do it. So the valuation of oil goes from negative to positive to negative to positive, depending on how human beings think. But the chemistry of the oil and the properties of oil are still the same. So this is very important, because this is the only way that we can understand why people trade with each other. And once you understand that valuation is subjective, you understand that two different people can have different valuation of the same good. And that's why it makes sense for me to trade with you, because I give you something that I value less, and you give me something that you value less, so we both benefit from it. That's why we can understand that trade is mutually beneficial, because everybody has a different valuation of objects. So this helps us understand so much about how human beings make decisions, and one of the most important ways is what is called the water-diamond paradox, which I discuss in more detail in the book. Why is it that water is cheap when water is essential? We would die if we don't have water. And diamonds are not essential, but diamonds are very expensive. And the answer is because in the context where we make the valuation in a society in which water is usually plentiful and diamonds are very rare, our valuation for things declines as we have more and more of them. But if we were on an island in which water was not present and you couldn't have any water, then in that situation, you would value water a lot more. You would be valuing water likely more than diamonds. So the value is not inherent in things, it's subjective, and understanding that makes economics make sense. Before that, economics really struggles to make sense. Third fundamental point that I discuss in the third chapter in order to lay the groundwork for the book is time. Human time is scarce. We don't have infinite time, and so because it's scarce, it's an economic good. But it's different from all other economic goods in two ways that make it unique. First, time can't be reversed. We don't have a way of replaying time, and it cannot be increased indefinitely. We all have a clock that runs out at some day, unfortunately, and we can't just keep extending that clock. So it really is the one thing that is the most scarce, because we can make more of everything out there except time. And this is, I think, a very powerful idea which maybe not necessarily from the Austrian school that I got, but I think it fits well with the Austrian school, which is that there are no physical or natural constraints on the production of any physical good. We can keep making more of any particular good in the world. If we just invest more time in its production, we'll always be able to make more of it. So we can understand scarcity as a product of the scarcity of time. The reason that we don't have more of oil or copper or zinc or nickel or cars or apples or oranges is not because there's this particular limit on how much of that stuff exists in the world. It's because of how much effort and time we dedicate to producing those things. And the reason we don't do more of them is because there's an opportunity cost in terms of our time. So we don't have more oranges because we want to make apples and we want to make cars and we want to get zinc and copper and gold. And we're economizing between how much we produce from all of those things. The limit is not how much of those things exists on Earth. There's no fixed capacity for how much we can produce. The limit is how much we are willing to put into our time into the production process to make these. So this is why, if you want to get a scale of just how huge Earth is, if you look at all of the world's mines, all of the mines that are in the world, I think with being very generous about the size of those mines, they would be the size of half a glass of water compared to an Olympic swimming pool, which is the Earth. So if Earth is one giant Olympic swimming pool, every mine that we have in the world, every mine that we have ever dug, is half a cup of water. So when people talk about worrying about running out of oil or copper or zinc or any particular resource, remember that 8 billion people and all of the people that came before us have only managed to drink half a cup from this giant Olympic pool. So it's essentially a rounding error. So the limit on how much we have of all of those resources is not how much water is in the pool, it's how much time we have to take the water out of the pool. That's ultimately it. And I think this is a very important point to understand, that the scarcity of the world is not the scarcity of physical things. The physical things are enormously abundant. The more we dig, the more we find. The scarcity is in the time that we dedicate for it. And that's why every year we have more oil than the year before. If you look at the proven reserves of oil, how much oil we have today in the world that we know we can get, it keeps growing. Every year we consume more, but every year we have more left because we keep finding more and more. So the more we consume, the more we look for more oil, the more we find more oil. The limit then is not the quantity of oil. The limit is our time. The limit is how much we can dedicate time to that process of getting that. So resources just become more abundant over time as we consume more. And economics then, I like to present it as the economizing of time. We are constantly trying to increase the quantity and quality of time that we have on this earth. This is how I can think of economics. Yes, we're economizing for things, but ultimately those things are just different manifestations of the thing that we're really economizing for, which is our time, how we allocate our time between all those different resources. And so with this foundation in the first 3 chapters of the book, as you can see on the left side, there's the list of the chapters. We then move on to the second part of the book, which is on economy, how people economize. And it discusses 5 different ways in which people economize individually. These are the forms of economy that you can do on your own. These are the things that we economize individually. And then the third part of the book, the market order, discusses economizing in a social context, how humans economize with one another. So how do we economize? How do we act economically as human beings in order to secure the things that we value and desire? Well, the first way we do that is labor. We work. So we recognize that there's a tasty-looking rabbit running around. If I work and try and catch it, then I will have rabbit to eat. And so human reason is capable of realizing that if you work, you're able to get the things that you want. And this is something we share with animals. Animals also work. They hunt and they work to get the things that they want. And that allows us to produce the things that we want. And so we think about labor, we discuss the concept of labor, and we discuss the concept of unemployment. And I think an important point to keep about unemployment is that unemployment really is something that has emerged only in the 20th century under inflationary money. I think it's really remarkable that if you look at Google Ngrams, the chart that you see on the left, this is a Google service where you can enter any term, and you can see how common this term has been over time. And they're measuring what percentage of the words in particular, in all of the books that they scanned. You know, Google have scanned millions of books from all over the world. So they look at the prevalence of this term. And what do they find here? They find that as up until the early 20th century, nobody used the word unemployment. This was not a thing that people thought about. People don't get unemployed. People work, or if they don't want to work, they don't work. But this notion of unemployment as a pathology, as a problem, as millions of people who want to work but can't find work, this is only a product of the monetary system that is inflationary, that creates business cycles, as we'll discuss a little bit later. And we can also see this in the example of Switzerland. When Switzerland was on the gold standard, it practically had no unemployment. When it moved on to inflationary money, we see unemployment becoming a topic that is more common. We see unemployment takes off in Switzerland. And that, I think, is a very interesting thing to analyze, which I get into more detail in the book. I'm going to basically I should have told you earlier, I'm going to be going through all the chapters. So that means I'm covering all the material, but I'm not getting into it in depth. So I hope that's okay with you. So you're going to have to pay especially close attention. Now, the second way in which people economize is property. We realize that we can benefit by taking things as property, using them as property, acquiring them, maintaining them, taking care of them, and preventing others from accessing them allows us to increase our productivity. And this concept of property is the only way that we can have a market economy. The only way that we can have an economy in which people cooperate is if we respect property rights. So it's a very important foundational concept in economics and in a market economy and in civilized society to accept the concept of property rights. It's the foundation of a market economy. And the sixth chapter discusses capital, and that is also a very important topic. Capital is a form of property that is used in the production of consumer goods. So you don't, capital is something that you own not because you consume, but because you use it to produce goods that you consume. And this is something that distinguishes us from animals. This is where we start becoming better than animals. So animals can work, we can work. Animals have some sense of property. We kind of have we have a sense of property. But capital is really when we start building tools, and that's where we separate ourselves from animals, because with very small exceptions, animals can't really handle tools. So we start building tools and we start using them to produce things, and that increases our productivity. And it increases the length of the production process. We start producing things over a longer time period because it makes it more efficient. So a good example to think about it is in terms of fishing. You can fish with your own hands, you catch 0 to 3 fish in a day. You can fish with a fishing rod, you get maybe 10 fish in a day. You can fish with a small boat, you get 100 fish. And then you can fish with a giant trawler, and in that case you get maybe 5 tons of fish. So as you see, the same person can increase his productivity enormously depending on how much capital he has. And so this ability to recognize the importance of capital is one of the most important things that we do economically, because as we start developing capital, it increases our productivity and it changes our life drastically. So all capital has to come from saving. Saving is what gives us capital in the first place. So a fisherman has to give up on leisure, on fishing, in order to build a fishing rod. You have to sacrifice in order to build capital. You can't make capital for free. You have to forego consumption. You have to get off the beach and enjoying yourself on the beach and go and work to try and build a fishing rod. Or you stop hunting for a day. Instead of catching fish for a day, you go hungry for a day because you build the fishing rod in that day. Why do you do that? Why would you sacrifice a whole day? Because on the next day, it gives you higher productivity. So the key thing to understand about capital is that it does require the postponement of consumption. It does require the delay of gratification. And this is true for the fisherman on the beach. It's also true for Boeing. When Boeing wants to build an airplane, they have to spend 9 years from the point of designing the airplane until the airplane earns the first cent when they sell the first one. There's a 9-year period. During those 9 years, they have to be paying all of their workers. They have to be buying all of the capital goods. So somebody has to be foregoing consumption. The people who are shareholders in Boeing are taking money that they could have used to consume. They could be buying Ferraris, they could be buying boats, they could be throwing giant parties. Instead, they choose to take that money and put it in the production process, because it will allow them to have a better return in the future. It'll allow them more consumption in the future. So only through the delay of gratification, only through the postponement of consumption are we able to accumulate capital in the first place. And of course, this is a topic that has a lot of misconceptions about it. People talk of capital as if it is a gift from heaven, as if it is something that, some people are born with capital and other people are not, and the people who are born with capital are always exploiting the people who don't have capital. I don't think this is a correct way of thinking of this question. Capital isn't a gift from heaven. It is something that is very hard to have. It's hard to get it because, first of all, you have to delay gratification. You have to give up on consumption, which is not fun. You could be consuming and throwing a party. Instead, you give up the party so that you can have capital. And it can be destroyed. It can, just because you gave up on it doesn't mean it will succeed in producing the thing that you want. It depreciates over time. It's constantly declining in terms of its value because machines ruin and fall apart and they need maintenance. And there's risks involved. There are many risks involved because the business idea that you have might not be working. Somebody might find a better way of doing things. The productivity might not be good enough, and it can fail. So choosing to invest in capital is a really risky thing, and it's not a guaranteed thing, and it's something that is usually difficult for most people to pull off. But it's not something that is It's not a gift as many Marxists like to portray it. In fact, as Mises says, Mises, the Austrian school economist, he says, capital is a responsibility to society. It's not a privilege. It's not as if somebody is born rich and they have the privilege and then they get to keep that capital. No matter how much capital you have, it's only capital if you're using it in the service of society, in the sense of producing goods for society that are valued by society more than the inputs that go into the production process. So if the things that you put into the production process are more valuable than the output, then you're destroying your capital. So it's a responsibility because you have to use it in the service of people to make people's lives better. And if you don't make people's lives better, then it's going to depreciate and it's going to decline in value and you're going to lose it. So the only people who have capital are people who are using the capital in the service of others. And that's why you can think of it as a responsibility more than a privilege. You have to wake up every morning and use that capital in a way that is productive. And if you don't, you lose it. You no longer have capital. And that is why capital is so important, and that is why it's so difficult to attain it. Now, Chapter 7 discusses technology. I'd like to think of technology as a way in which we economize, because technology really is a form of capital, but it is non-physical capital. You can think of technology as being something that we put into the production process, but because it is not physical, it's unique in that it doesn't depreciate over time, and it's non-rival, so more and more people can copy it. One person needs to invent one wheel, and then billions of people can copy it and keep using the wheel. It's the idea of the wheel is so much more powerful than any one particular wheel itself. And so technology is a very important way in which we economize, because it's the most productive and most sustainable way for economizing, because it doesn't run into diminishing returns like physical capital. And a common misconception, of course, is that technology replaces labor, but really technology just increases the productivity of labor. If ever since hundreds of years, people have been saying that, the new machines are going to put workers out of business. In Britain, there were people called the Luddites who would go and break sewing machines because they thought they would put sewers out of business. The people who sew clothes with their hands, they thought they were going to go out of business because of those machines. And here we are, 300 years later. People in Britain have more clothes than ever, and they have a better standard of living than ever, and they all continue to find work if they want it. The more machines, the more productivity they have. It has not replaced labor. It has just increased the productivity of labor. So technology is how we go from being a world in which we have slaves carrying heavy things on their back to carriages, to horse-drawn carriages, to trains, to trucks, and to giant ships. We always have people working in the transportation process, in the industry of transportation, but the more capital we have and the more technology advances, the more the productivity goes up and the more productive these things are. but we don't ever run out of jobs in transportation. We continue to have more transportation, but the jobs, they used to be very, very tough and brutal and low productivity. Slave carries heavy things on his back and walks. Now, the transportation worker sits in an air-conditioned room and controls thousands of kilograms of heavy material being shipped on automated trains or automated trucks in some places. So think about just how much more work you can do as somebody today with all of the modern capital versus how much work you could do before. So increasing productivity really can be seen as what has eliminated slavery. It's because of modern technology and modern productivity that it's no longer economical to have slaves. At a time when we had very low amounts of energy and very low productivity, having a slave increases your productivity enormously. If you can get somebody else to work for you, the amount of power and energy that you're able to use every day doubles. But now when we have all these machines and all this advanced technology, having an extra person added to all of those machines as a slave is only adding a very tiny little extra marginal benefit that is not worth the drama of slavery. And so it's really the increase in productivity that eliminates slavery. It doesn't eliminate labor. It makes labor so much better. It improves the conditions of labor. It makes labor so much more valuable. And it makes it so that it makes sense for the capitalist and the owner of the machines to pay a higher wage for the worker, because the worker becomes more and more productive because he's using capital. And in chapter 8, I discussed the concept of energy and power. And I think usually you don't read about these in the context of an economics textbook. But I think it is very useful to think of these things as economic phenomena, because it is because of these things, because humans are always economizing in terms of their energy. We're always making our choices about how much energy we can utilize. And human civilization advances by us having more energy available at our disposal. But what I argue is, if we think about economics in terms of subjective valuation and marginal valuation, I make the case that we can't really say that we have energy as an economic good, because energy is abundant. The economic good is what we use at the margin. It's energy over time. It's power. So the sun gives the earth more energy in a day than all the energy that all of our power plants produce in an entire year. All of the world's power plants in a year don't produce as much energy as the sun gives the earth in one day. Does that mean that we don't need the power plants? No. The abundance of the sun's sunshine is not what we want. We're not looking for aggregate quantities of sunshine and energy. We're looking for energy directed to meet our needs at the time and place that we want them, at the margin. And that's a very important point to understand in terms of marginal analysis. And so therefore, what we really look for is power, how much we can dedicate of that energy over a particular period of time in order to increase our productivity, in order to meet our needs. And for that, I think it's more useful to think about power as the economic good rather than energy. And that, for me, helps us understand why hydrocarbon fuels continue to be so popular. You know, it's been 30, 40, 50 years now that we keep hearing about the energy transition, that people want to move away from hydrocarbons to wind and solar. And we've had governments spend many, many, many trillions of dollars on these projects. And yet, global consumption of energy is still roughly the same in terms of hydrocarbons. We still consume about 80-85% of energy from hydrocarbons. And that doesn't go down, because what we're looking for is not energy in terms of wind or solar. We're looking for power and the place and at the time and place where we want it to be. And in order to have that, we need to have sources of energy that can provide power on demand when we want it and where we want it. And so that's why I believe we continue to use hydrocarbon energy, because what we're after is not so much energy, it's power. And they're very good at delivering power when and where we want it, on demand. So we economize not energy, we economize energy at the margin. That means power. And this is why, as I said, oil and gas are valuable. Now we move toward economizing within the market order with trade, money, markets, and capitalism. What is trade? trade is what happens when people start economizing socially, when they start meeting each other and economizing with one another. Economizing in a social context. People can only interact in two ways, consent and coercion. You deal with a person in a way that pleases both of you, or you deal with them in a way that is to your benefit at his expense, against his will. So in this part of the book, we discuss the consensual dealings. So when two people agree to exchange things, they are economizing. So why do they agree to it? Because they have different valuations of that thing. So one person values it more than the other. And so the two people benefit from trade because they both are getting the thing that they value more. So that is how people benefit from this situation. That's how we can expect. That's why we expect that both parties benefit in consensual trade. That's why we can also expect that if there's something that's being done by force, one person is forcing somebody else, then at least one of these people is going to be worse off. The person that's being forced is arguably worse off than if he wasn't. If I get you to do something by putting a gun to your head, then arguably you would have been better off without doing that thing, because if it was better for you, you wouldn't need me to put a gun to your head. So trade is the opposite of that. Trade is consensual. People both benefit because they are dealing with each other voluntarily. And so trade shows us that the gains from trade in the long run will exceed the spoils of violence. So think about two people on an island. If they fight, one person kills the other, and then he takes all of his stuff. That's it. You took him one off, and then you're stuck alone on the island forever. But if you have two people and they cooperate with one another, well then all their life they can benefit from each other. So you're better off being peaceful toward people because you benefit from trading with them. And that realization, I think, is one of the most powerful and profound realizations about why we should want to live in a civilized and peaceful society. Because the benefits that accrue to us from respecting each other's property rights and respecting each other's lives and trading with each other consensually far exceed anything that we could achieve in isolation outside of trade. So think, no matter how strong and how smart you are, if you lived alone on an island, you are going to be extremely, extremely, extremely poor. You will have to wake up every day, defend yourself from animals, from nature. You need to secure your own food. No matter how strong or smart you are, it's going to be very difficult for you to secure yourself an easy existence. But if you live in a modern world in which you're dealing in a market of 8 billion people that are mostly peaceful and dealing with one another, and you're able to trade with these people and you're able to exchange goods with them, well then you just need to produce one tiny little thing and sell it to several people, and then you'll be able to secure so much of the resources. Think about how much better your life is when you are able to buy clothes and buy food and buy a house by just working one job. If you lived on an island, you'd have to build all of that stuff on yourself. So it's really the understanding of the division of labor that makes us as human beings want to live in a peaceful society. It's what allows us to live in a much better life. And that's why we should be peaceful with one another, because if we're fighting, it doesn't matter how much smarter or stronger you are than the others. If you're fighting with them, you are not going to benefit as much as you cooperate with them. And that's, I think, really the fundamental point for why society is a good thing, why people join society, why people have a lot of people say bad things about civilization and society, but really try and live without civilization and society and see how well that goes for you. That's why, they say those things, but they don't act upon them. They don't want to live outside of society. And so that's why trade is so beneficial. But direct trade, exchanging one good for another, is very limited in its scope because it's limited by the fact that people don't always want what the other person has. However, if we live in a society that has a large society where a lot of people want to trade with one another in many goods, then naturally we develop something called a money. And money is a medium of exchange. It's something that we all use for trade, so we all trade with one another. And this is what creates the possibility for trade to exist in large circles, in a much larger division of labor, which allows us to have a much, much higher productivity. So anything can be money, but most economics textbooks think of money in terms of whatever the state says is money. You're taught that the government prints the money And if the government didn't print the money, then we wouldn't have money, and we'd all sit there looking at each other like idiots, unable to figure out what to do. That's not how it actually works. In reality, and from the Austrian perspective, money is a product of the market. Money emerges on the market in the same reason that all other kinds of products emerge on the market. People realize that there's a need, and they act to fulfill that need. And so I want to buy something from you, you want something that I don't have, and you don't want this thing that I have. So I need to go find something else. And that thing is called the medium of exchange. So I go find what you have, find somebody who has it, and who wants what I have, I exchange it with him. That thing becomes the medium of exchange. So a medium of exchange is anything that you use for exchange. You don't acquire it for its own sake as a good because you want to consume it, and you don't give it, and you don't use it for production. So it's not a capital good, it's not a consumption good, it's an exchange good. That's what a medium of exchange is. And anything can be used as a medium of exchange, but if it's very good at medium of exchange, eventually it becomes the medium of exchange. That generalized medium of exchange that everybody uses as a medium of exchange is what is referred to as money. And so we can see that as emerging naturally on a market. And if we are able to understand what are the things that make this a good medium of exchange, we can realize why certain things emerge as money. The Austrian school is the only school that explains money as a product of human action, as a product of the market, rather than a product of government edicts. And that's why there are specific properties that make good money and specific properties that make for bad money. Money is transportable, homogeneous, divisible, groupable, durable, and hard to make. And I think the most important one today is that it is hard to make, because all the other ones are pretty trivial to arrange. So this gives us the emergence of money, and then if we have money, we can have markets. That's what the market economy is. So a place in which people economize in all of those individual and collective ways we discussed. People are working, they have property rights, they have capital, they have technology, they're consuming growing amounts of energy, they trade with one another, and they use money. If you have that, if you have a society in which these things are being conducted, then what you have is what we call a market economy. It's a social order in which people are able to cooperate in very large numbers on economic production, providing goods and services for one another to the benefit of all involved voluntarily, without a coercive authority dictating and coordinating their actions. And so the market economy hugely increases the productivity of labor. If you work within a market economy, you are infinitely more productive than if you work in isolation. People cooperate because of self-interest. We don't have somebody putting a gun to our head forcing us to cooperate with one another. We wake up every morning and we cooperate because we realize the alternative if we don't cooperate is we go hungry and starve. And because of this, because of our ability to coordinate, and because we have money, we're able to coordinate all of our economic production and our activity with only our self-interest, thanks to being able to perform economic calculation with prices that are denominated in money. And this is how we understand the process of supply and demand. And that's how we get to the situation. That's how then we understand and explain, elaborate the concepts of supply and demand. So this system where we have a market economy is called capitalism. And the chapter 12 discusses the concept of capitalism and explains what capitalism is. And capitalism is a system of private ownership of capital goods in which individuals can buy and sell capital freely, and they can decide how to employ their capital. They get the rewards from the capital deployment, and they suffer the losses if there are losses. That system in which the key thing to understand about capitalism is that you have the private ownership of the capital. If there is a free market in the ownership of capital, then you have a capitalist society. And this is an extremely important point. It's not just a small bragging point that, yeah, we have a market, we can buy and sell capital. It's extremely important because if you have a market in capital, that means the owners of capital can perform economic calculation to figure out what are the most useful ways in which we can have capital. And so a lot of people think that the problem of socialism is a problem of incentive, that socialist societies fail because people don't have an incentive to work because they don't get rich. I don't think that that is the truth. That there is truth in that, but that's not the real problem of why socialism fails. I think socialism fails because of economic calculation, because of the impossibility of performing economic calculation to figure out how to allocate capital if there is no market in capital. This is a very important point that you can't solve with incentive. So socialist societies solved the incentive problem. They put a gun to people's head and they tell them if you don't work, you get shot. You get sent to the gulag. Not going to the gulag is a bigger incentive than getting rich. So socialism doesn't have a motivation problem. They definitely solved the motivation problem. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, it didn't collapse because nobody was showing up to work. People were going to work, but the factories weren't working. Why? Because they could not perform economic calculation. Why could the factory not work? So you'd go to the car factory and they can't work because they don't have zinc. And so because they don't have zinc, they can't make the car. Why don't they have zinc? Well, because they weren't able to make their calculations to get the right amount of zinc. The zinc factory couldn't provide them with enough. Why do these dislocations happen in a socialist economy? Because the zinc factory, the metal factory, the rubber factory, and the car factory, and the train factory are all owned by the same entity. And that entity doesn't witness any prices. They don't have the ability to figure out, should we put the metal into making more trains, or should we make more cars? They have no idea of figuring that out because there's no market for trains, there's no market for cars, there's no market for the zinc, there's no market for the iron. This is a very, very important point, and I wish socialists would understand this, because if they did, they wouldn't be socialists. But unfortunately, most of them don't. And Mises spoke about this 100 years ago. It's a very, very powerful critique of socialism. And it was so powerful that it made the socialists change their socialist ideas in the 1920s. And part of the reason that socialism lasted so long is because they figured out this and they reformed some of their policies, and they accepted that we need to have some form of market, we need to have some sort of form of property that allowed them to operate for longer than they could have operated it. So this is really Mises' criteria of what constitutes a socialist economy or a capitalist economy. A capitalist economy has a stock market. If you have a stock market, that means capital is privately owned. People can privately choose to allocate capital and buy it and sell it, and the value of capital goes up or down depending on how it is allocated. That allows us to allocate capital efficiently. So that then moves us to the economics of money, monetary economics. From the Austrian perspective, we begin the analysis of money from understanding time preference. Time preference is the degree of discounting of the future, how much people value the future compared to the present. Everybody values the present more than the future because the present is certain and the future is uncertain. But as we become more civilized, we start discounting the future less. So we value the future more. We still value it less than the present, but we discount it less and less. So we start becoming more future-oriented. We start providing more for the future. That means we start deferring consumption, as we were mentioning in the chapter on capital. We stop consuming everything that we have. We start saving some of our consumption in order to make more capital so that we can engage in more production. And that increases our productivity and gives us a better standard of living. So this, according to economist Hans Hermann Hoppe, is what we could call the process of civilization. As our time preference declines, we start thinking more of the future, so we start deferring consumption and we start increasing our capital accumulation. The increase in capital accumulation causes the price of capital to decline, so capital becomes more available, which causes us to have more capital deployed in production, which increases our productivity. That's the point of deploying capital. Remember how the fisherman catches more fish if he has more capital. So the more we lower our time preference, the more capital we have, the higher our productivity. That increases our standard of living. And then when our standard of living increases and our present is better, then we're able to think of the future further, and our time preference declines even further, and we accumulate more and more resources, and we continue to save more, and our productivity continues to go up. That's essentially what we can call civilization. And so if investment is financed with lowering of time preference, that means we're deferring consumption, and that makes our productivity go up. But if we finance investment without deferring consumption, without reducing our time preference, then big problems happen. And that's the topic of the next chapter on credit and banking. So there are two ways in which credit and banking work. There's commodity credit, what Mises calls commodity credit, is when the lender sacrifices consumption. So you take money that you could have spent on the party, on the sports car, and you instead invest it in production process. In that situation, you're giving real resources to the person who's engaging in production, because you've deferred the consumption. So you've taken resources that you could have spent on a consumer good and you're instead investing them in a production good. So instead of eating the grain, you plant the grain so you get more grains next year. But there's another kind of credit, which is what happens when banks just issue credit without somebody saving, without somebody deferring consumption. And this is the equivalent of eating the grains and also thinking that if you get a piece of paper that has a grain drawing on it, you can put it on the ground and then it will make more grains. So that's effectively what happens when governments or banks create credit without saving, without the corresponding decline in time preference. And that, as Mises says, the expansion of credit cannot form a substitute for capital. And that is the Austrian theory of the business cycle. That's why we get recessions from the Austrian perspective. It's because people make investments without having sacrificed the amount of capital that was necessary for the investment to happen. So that is the discussion on monetary economics. And then the final section of the book discusses how the market order is fundamental to the building of human civilization. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through these chapters very quickly, but you can read if you read very quickly on the slides. The first chapter discusses the concept of violence. So remember, we said that trade is the way in which people deal with each other consensually, where we accept each other's property rights and we deal in a way that doesn't infringe on anybody. But we can deal in another way. We can use violence, and we can use the threat of violence, and that's coercion. So what happens when people do that? Well, that's a bad thing. Obviously, people don't want it. But that's just another economic good. Freedom from coercion and freedom from abuse and violence and the threat of violence is just an economic good. And defense from violence is just another economic good. Generally, the way most economics textbooks would and most politics textbooks think of it is that the role of the state is to protect people from aggression. I present the counter-argument that, in fact, the state itself is a form of aggression against people because it can only get all of its money through aggression. And it, in fact, is only acts through aggression, whereas and it's not very effective at stopping aggression. So government is usually presented as the solution to the problem of aggression, but if government is a monopoly, that we have a monopoly in aggression, well, we saw why monopolies don't work for capital. We saw why it doesn't work in markets for goods. If we have a monopoly for apples in Spain, you're going to have a big problem with apples. So why would it work for security? Why would the provision of security work if there was one monopolist? And thinking in terms of the economic decision-making and human action, you realize that it's unlikely to work because you don't have a market in capital, so you don't have an easy way of allocating it. And so therefore, the government can end up being an impediment to a peaceful social order because it violates those rules because it's a monopoly and it doesn't have to compete. But in reality, if you look around, you'll see that actually the market for defense is mostly provided on the market. The majority of security personnel in the world are private. There are more private security personnel than there are police in the world. You could even argue that police are not in the business of securing people, they are in the business of securing the government. If you want security for your own house, for your own business, if you have a bank, if you have a jewelry shop and you want security, people usually get private security. And that really makes sense, because why should the government get to decide who gets how much security? Who gets to decide if everybody's paying taxes? How do we allocate the security? Should the rich people get more security, or should the poor people get more security because they live in more dangerous neighborhoods? There's no correct way of making allocation centrally, because there's no way of performing economic calculation, as we were discussing on the chapter of capitalism. And I think this applies for the problem of defense, and that's why increasingly defense is a good that is sold in the market, and people buy their defense freely on the market. So that's the topic of chapter 17. And then finally, chapter 18 discusses civilization, how we arrive at what we mean by civilization, what the role of economics is. So we can think of civilization as the emergent result of humans acting freely to improve their well-being. Everything discussed in the book so far. So a world in which people respect each other's property, a world in which people are able to economize freely, a world in which people are able to trade with one another and accumulate capital and think about new technologies and increase their energy consumption, is a world in which we are advancing as a civilization. And we can think of that as really what we mean by civilization is that it's the improvement in quality of life and how we view it subjectively over generations, that each generation gives a better life to the next generation. That's really the essential idea of civilization. And we do that by doing all of the things that we mentioned in this chapter so far, everything from chapter 4 to chapter 15. And the way that we get that is through subjugating our base animalistic instincts to our reason. As human beings, we realize your base animal wants to fight, it wants to indulge its urges at every moment, but only by suppressing that and subjugating it to your reason are we able to respect each other's property, are we able to live in a civilized society, and are we able to have a society that improves the quality of life over time, which gives us a reason to live and a reason to be optimistic about the future, a reason to want to start a family, and a reason to give the life, to give children a better life than ours. And that's really why, because civilization makes us so much more powerful, so much more subjectively better off. No matter how strong or powerful you are, or how aggressive you are powerless if you're alone next to somebody who is part of a civilization. So a 10-year-old girl who is part of the civilization can have access to a gun that would allow her to kill the most powerful, violent animal, whether it's a human animal or a non-human animal. One shot, one bullet is enough to kill it. And a 10-year-old can pull that trigger if she's part of the division of labor. That's really what I believe is so optimistic about civilization, that the people who have civilization is always going to be so much more powerful, because what we can produce collectively in a peaceful order where we cooperate to produce with very high productivity vastly supersedes what any one individual can produce alone, no matter how smart or how strong. And history can really be seen as a struggle between civilization and barbarism, between our desires for the fruits of civilization and our base instinctive desires that just want to be satisfied at the moment. I want to take this because I like it. But no, if I don't take it and I don't get into conflict and I learn to cooperate with people, the fruits that I would accrue from that over time vastly outweigh whatever I can get through violence or through aggression. And humanity is generally advancing and becoming more and more civilized, although I argue, I think in the 20th century we have been de-civilizing, because remember we said the entirety of the market economy depends on money, and it depends on the use of money. And when the money is being destroyed, which is the situation that I think we have entered in the 20th century, because we moved from gold as money to fiat government money, which is highly inflationary and is constantly losing value, all the other forms of economizing are undermined. So the destruction of money destroys labor, it destroys capital accumulation, it destroys our ability to advance technologically, it destroys our ability to have modern energy infrastructure, it destroys our ability to trade, and it destroys the market economy, it destroys the capitalist system. All of these things are undermined when we undermine money, and that for me is the driver of much of the problems of the world. And it sometimes looks like we're becoming more barbarian as a species. I believe it's because of the destruction of money, destroying the market economy on which civilization rests. This is the base foundation of civilization. And that's why I believe Bitcoin is such a big deal, because I believe Bitcoin is human reason's solution to the problem of government money. It's the technological solution to how we can stop having government destroy civilization with the destruction of money. And that's why there's a lot to be depressed about in the world, but I think if we can stop governments from destroying money, then I think we can restore human civilization. That's the optimistic note that I will end on. Thank you so much.